Today, we're talking football, baseball, basketball. I got 4 cards from the 3 most popular North American sports.
And I'm here to tell you which cards to buy, sell, or hold.
This is The Forecast. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Forecast. I'm Amber Wilson. I'm happy to be back here with you guys. Today I get to talk a little bit about everything because I've got some football for you, some basketball for you, some baseball for you. So we're going to cover a little of everything on today's show. And I've got 4 cards, 4 guys who I haven't gotten to talk about before in the hobby. So I'm excited about this one. But real quick, before I hop into it, if you haven't done so already, please click the bell icon, subscribe to our channel. It's free, it's quick, it's easy. It takes you 2 seconds, so go ahead and get it done. It really helps us out. All right, let's hop right into things, shall we? I'm going to start with basketball, and I'm going to start with a name that might be fresh on your mind because he's had some big games recently, even though he plays for the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so if you're not a Cavs fan, you're probably not really following the career closely of Colin Sexton. But even if you're not a Cavs fan, you might have heard about what he did against the Brooklyn Nets, because a lot of people were watching that game since that was the first game, I believe, that big 3 was together up in Brooklyn. Kyrie and James Harden and KD, and they came together, they played the Cavs, they lost to the Cavs, and they didn't just lose to the Cavs, they basically just lost to Colin Sexton. He had such a huge game in that one. I think he put up like 42 in that game, if I remember correctly. So he's a name that's on a lot of people's minds right now in the NBA community. And Colin Sexton, I mean, until recently, he was a player who was thought of as a gifted scorer and not much else beyond that. But what's interesting is if you look at Colin Sexton's career, and it's only been 3 seasons, it's a short career, he is a young guy, but he has improved in both field goal percentage and points per game every single year that he's been in the league thus far. And of course, he's having a monster season so far for the Cavs this season. He scored 20 plus points in 10 of their last 12 games this year. And of course, he had that 42-pointer against the Nets. So Colin Sexton is a player that a lot of people are starting to finally take notice of. And because of that, his card prices are increasing. So let's go ahead and look at what's happening with Colin Sexton's card in the hobby. His 2018 Prism Base PSA 10. Now, over the last 3 months, that's 90 days, his card is up 119% in value. If you look at this chart, you can see that big bump coming as, season starts and progresses, and he's getting these big bumps because of those 20 plus point performances that he keeps putting up. So the question is, does Colin Sexton have what it takes to become more than just a big time scorer? Can he become more of a complete player? Does Colin Sexton have a very bright future in the NBA? And what do we do with this card in the hobby? Jeff, do you buy? Do you sell? Or do you hold on Colin Sexton's card?
So, like my sister Amber, I went to the University of Florida, which means I've watched a lot of SEC basketball. And Colin Sexton, he was an Alabama player a few years ago. I really liked watching the kid, and I thought to myself, this kid can make some noise in the NBA. And here we are. It took him a little bit longer than some of his contemporaries from the 2018 draft class, but he has emerged. I like the year-over-year progression in his numbers. I like the style of his game. I think Colin Sexton can continue to go up from here. Maybe he emerges as yet another great player from the 2018 draft class alongside some guys who are already almost legends. I'm a buy on Colin Sexton.
So from one young guy in the NBA to another young guy in the NBA. So far, I'm just seeing a lot of upside from Colin Sexton this year. Not so much from this other guy that I'm going to talk about now in Kevin Porter Jr. Now, the problem with Kevin Porter Jr., though, isn't the talent, because that's nothing but upside when it comes to Kevin Porter Jr. The problem with Kevin Porter Jr. is the reputation and the attitude, seemingly the personality. He certainly had his troubles so far in his young NBA career. It's been a tumultuous one, to say the least. So this is a guy who, I think he was traded twice before he ever even stepped onto an NBA court. After he was drafted, he fell in the draft to 30th overall. He was a guy who, outside of those very few top huge names, he was supposed to be an elite talent coming out of that 2019 draft. He had his problems. He had his problems at USC. He slips in the draft because of the reputation regarding those problems. He gets bounced around the league before he even plays in the league. And then he ends up with the Cavs. And he had an okay rookie showing with the Cavaliers. He certainly showed some promise, but nothing insane. And we are talking about a guy who ends up as a second round pick, so the expectation's not that high, and then he has problems in the locker room. And we were hearing things like he recently had a blow up in the locker room, and so the Cavs trade him away. The Cavs get rid of him. He's too much of a headache. There was undisclosed reasons also for things that went on with him in Cleveland. It sounds like Kevin Porter Jr. is a difficult player in a difficult situation. So the thing is with Kevin Porter Jr., he ends up on the Houston Rockets, okay, with the departure of James Harden. And that ends up kind of being the perfect landing spot for him if you think about it, because it's a team that needs to get the cheap talent. They don't have to give up much for Kevin Porter Jr. because of his reputation, but if you strike on it, if you happen to hit on that trade, it could be monstrous for your franchise. This is what you need when you lose a top 10 player in the league like James Harden, having to trade him away. They're rebuilding now in Houston. Maybe they're rebuilding around John Wall, but they're certainly rebuilding. They got a whole boatload of picks in exchange for that James Harden trade. And here, Kevin Porter Jr., he's kind of like a pick, he's a wild card. He's a young guy in the NBA. He seemingly has all the talent in the world, but you don't know what you're going to get out of him in terms of his locker room presence and some of those off the court issues. So the Houston Rockets, they take a gamble, not a high price tag. You buy him cheap, essentially, with that trade. And maybe Kevin Porter Jr. in a new environment, in the right environment, will turn out to be that elite talent that we thought that he could be back in 2019 when he was so hyped coming into that draft. Or he could end up getting cut by the Houston Rockets and not be in the league in a year because he's too much of a headache. So lots of risk attached to Kevin Porter Jr., and so there's risk attached, of course, to his card in that regard as well. But his 2019 Prism Base PSA 10. Let's take a look at this card over the last 30 days. It's down just 2%. So that means basically over the last month, Kevin Porter Jr.'s card has been relatively stagnant. So Geoff, the question is, Kevin Porter Jr., he's now in a Houston Rockets uniform. Do you buy, do you sell, or do you hold?
So Cleveland traded Kevin Porter Jr. away for like a bag of potato chips. And I'm not even talking a good bag of potato chips. Like, these aren't even Lay's or Ruffles I'm talking about, as if Ruffles are even that great. Now, I'm talking about like Wise brand potato chips or Golden Flake potato chips. That is literally what they traded this guy for. And if Cleveland is going to let someone like that with that much talent walk out of the door so easily, it tells me there is some bad stuff going on with this kid. His prices really haven't dropped that much because people are interested in seeing what he can do and they still think he has talent. I'd back away from this guy right now. Sell while you can.
So we did a lot of basketball. Let's go ahead and move on to a little football. And I'm going to talk about a vet in the game in Matthew Stafford. Now, Matthew Stafford and the Detroit Lions agreed to mutually part ways just a few days ago. And that's not a shock, I don't think, to anybody. The Matthew Stafford experience in Detroit has been strange. The Lions, in 12 seasons that Matthew Stafford has been there, he's only played in 3 playoff games with that franchise. And yet, first overall pick in 2009, and a lot of people consider him to be a very good quarterback in the NFL. He's certainly been a consistent, decent presence in the NFL. So a lot of people think that his legacy is, at least for now, going to be considered a lot of talent wasted away in Detroit. And so that's why, of course, now you have Matthew Stafford in a position to look for another landing spot. The Lions also move forward as well to try to find their own answers in a different era. Now, Matt Stafford, he could end up on San Francisco. I don't know how Jimmy Garoppolo is going to feel about that. He could end up in New England. He could end up in Denver, Washington. Those are the teams that I hear most associated with Matthew Stafford, but he's certainly another quarterback potentially on the market, or he is on the market, I guess. He's another quarterback on the market who is a pretty big name. I mean, this season, this offseason, we're talking about potential quarterbacks on the market. Matthew Stafford, maybe Deshaun Watson. maybe Aaron Rodgers. I mean, these are really good quarterbacks who might be available in a way that quarterbacks are never available when they're this good. So it'll be interesting to watch where he ends up. It'll be also interesting to watch from the hobby perspective, because the question is, he's had a good NFL career. He has a good quarterback. How good? You know, some people would say he's just good. Some people would say Matthew Stafford could have been great if he was in the right situation. I don't think anybody thinks Matthew Stafford is a bad quarterback. So what's it look like if he lands in the right landing spot? And what is that going to do to his value in the hobby? Let's take a look at his 2009 Bowman Chrome Base PSA 10. Now, over the last 3 months, the last 90 days, this card has bounced all around. Ultimately, though, his card is up 41% in value. That means that his card is hitting a new recent high of $325. That's mostly due to this incoming trade anticipation, where people in the hobby are getting excited about the possibility of seeing Matthew Stafford in a different system and in a different uniform, and maybe he'll thrive outside of Detroit. So Geoff, the card price for Matthew Stafford has already started to go up. At this point in the game, would you buy, would you sell, or would you hold?
So when I first heard Matthew Stafford was going to leave the Lions, I kind of equated it in my head to Phillip Rivers leaving the Chargers, going to Indianapolis this season. It was a nice move for him. He gave the Colts somewhat of a boost, but ultimately it was nowhere near enough to get the Colts over the hump. And that's kind of how I started to feel about Stafford as well. However, I will say that Stafford is like 5 years younger than Phillip Rivers, so he does have a bit more game out ahead of him. And Stafford has been putting up some really nice numbers in Detroit, not really showing signs yet of slowing down. So depending where he lands, I am perhaps a pensive buy on Matthew Stafford.
Now, I want to remind you guys, if you haven't checked it out already, we have a new version of Market Movers called Market Movers Lite. It's where you get all the card price charts, like the one that I've showed you all episode long, all the ones I've showed you on this episode, all the ones I show you every week here on the Forecast. So you guys definitely want to check that out. I get messages from people, DMs from people all the time asking me about specific cards in my opinion, and I always send them to Market Movers because there's just nothing better than checking out the information for yourself, collected by our experts, the real data in real time, what's happening in the hobby. You definitely want that information at your fingertips if you are serious about this investing game. Okay, we've covered football. We've covered basketball. So that leaves baseball for us, right? Let's talk some baseball cards. We're going to talk Fernando Tatis Jr. Now, I don't know if there's a hotter player in baseball than this dude. Of course, last year he won the Silver Slugger Award. He was named the All-MLB First Team. Quite an accomplishment for such a young guy. He had a fantastic sophomore season in the bigs. He came in 4th in the NL MVP voting. He finished 2nd in NL home runs and 4th in ribbies and stolen bases. So the numbers for Fernando Tatis Jr. are so impressive for a young guy in the league. He's absolutely one of the hottest players in baseball and one of the hottest players in the baseball card market right now. So that's why I wanted to talk about where he sits now as we look towards this next upcoming season. Let's take a look at Tatis Jr.'s 2019 Topps Gold PSA 10. Now, over the last 90 days, his card is up 75% in value. So the question is, are you capitalizing on this seller's market by selling now? Are you buying Fernando Tatis Jr. now, even though his card continues to go up and we're talking about an elevated price at this point? Are you holding on to his card in anticipation of what he'll accomplish in the coming years, because the future looks so bright for such a young star in the MLB? Geoff, Fernando Tatis Jr., do you buy, do you sell, or do you hold?
So one of the cool things about Fernando Tatis Jr. is this guy seems to have a lot of personality and swag. And when it comes to the sports card hobby, people like chasing cards, not just to players who put up good numbers, but also players who have good personalities. Tatis is starting to become more of a household name with all of those Gatorade commercials he's now doing. He seems to have some real personality to him. I also like the fact he looks different than most players. He's got a unique look out there on the field. This guy is just kind of fun to watch and obviously putting up fantastic numbers. Nobody is doubting that. San Diego, a much improved team. I like what they got going on out there. And even though Tatis's Cards have already gone crazy, I'm still a buy.
All right, guys, so there you have it. You heard the man himself. I had fun today. We got to talk a little bit of everything. Of course, we have the Super Bowl coming up. We have basketball heating up. We're about a quarter of the way through the NBA season in a 72-game season. And baseball, it'll be here before you know it. So join me again next week right here on The Forecast. It drops every Thursday. Of course, Geoff will be back on Sunday on the Sports Card Investor channel with more content for you. Again, click the bell icon if you haven't done so already. And as always, guys, happy investing.